Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to the publication workshop on how to prepare your manuscript properly, proudly presented by AEMS Association. This seminar will provide an editor's perspective on a journal's 3 R's: readers, writers, and reviewers, as well as the tips for writing clearly, organized, publishable, and highly cited papers. The main resource speaker for today's webinar is Professor Brian D. Fath. Professor Brian is a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Towson University, United States, teaching courses on ecosystem ecology, environmental science, and human ecology. He is also a senior research scholar at the International Institute for Applied System Analysis, and since 2011, the scientific coordinator of IIAS's Young Scientists Summer Program. He has published over 200 research papers, reports, and book chapters on environmental system modeling, specifically in the areas of network analysis, urban metabolism, and sustainability. Dr. Brian is also a co-editor-in-chief for current research in environmental sustainability and past editor-in-chief of ecological modeling as well. He served as editor for major reference works, Encyclopedia of Ecology and Handbook of Environmental Management. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and honor to invite Professor Brian Fath to officially start this workshop.
All right, thank you, Austin, for the introduction. Very kind, and also the very ambitious idea that this is the only workshop you'll ever need. That's a lot of pressure on that flyer, but let's see. Yeah, welcome everybody. It really is my pleasure to be here talking with you. I'm actually in Vienna, Austria, just south of Vienna at the moment, at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And so I guess our time zones don't differ by too much, but wherever you are in the world, welcome. Yeah, let me go ahead and share some slides with you and go through some tips that I have put together here from over the years of doing some editing work. Let's see, hopefully you can see that. Yeah, as Austin mentioned, that I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the journal Environmental, Current Research in Environmental Sustainability, and past editor for 12 years for ecological modeling. So most of what I'll be talking about today is experience that I have with those are both Elsevier journals. I have also published and reviewed for a number of other major publishing companies as well too. So yeah, so writing a good journal, you know, how do you get ready to do that? What are the preparations that you need? And you really have to think about who the audience is. Some journals are very specialized, that you're talking to peers that already know the jargon or the technical terms that you're using. Other times we're doing more interdisciplinary research and we're trying to talk across disciplines. And that's important then to use the right language, or maybe we're trying to reach a general audience. Maybe it's a paper that is not even geared for scientists or for specialists. And so we need to, again, use a different language. So always be aware to adjust your writing style depending on who the audience is. And then when you think about where you're going to publish it, each journal has its own style. And so it's important to read the other articles in those in the journal that you want to target to get a sense for how they are presenting the research and the kind of language that they use, and get an idea of what papers can get accepted there. And then of course, check the scope of the journal that is always available online. I know sometimes we get our hearts set on publishing in a particular journal, but more often than not, those will just be rejected even without review, which means that you're not getting any feedback on it, just delaying things. So so yeah, you can change journals rather than submitting inappropriately. You really save time for both yourself and for the editors who are handling the papers that are out of scope of the journal. Another thing that I think is really important to keep in mind, you invest a lot of time to do the research and a lot of time to write up the research, but the reality is that your audience doesn't spend a lot of time on that paper typically. And so to keep this in mind, that the title and who is writing it is really the first thing that anybody's going to notice about the paper. And so that 10 seconds, you're going to just scan the title, and if it's a catchy title, then that's going to maybe get them to the next stage. And the next stage would be to look at the abstract. And abstracts are intentionally short. Most journals nowadays even have highlights, which I'll talk about in just a minute, but you can hope that maybe somebody spends a minute on your abstract. If they still like it after that, then maybe they'll do just a quick skim of the paper and give it 5 more minutes. And since everyone is super busy, even 5 minutes of their time is something that is should be appreciated, I guess. And even a full read. People learn to read quickly and to read for things they're looking for. And so the idea of somebody really sitting down and reading word for word from the first word to your last word and taking a couple of hours, maybe even doing that is pretty rare. And so you really need to be able to catch their attention in each of those key aspects, quickly and effectively. Another thing that publishers are going to consider when you submit the paper is, what is the impact of that paper? Is it have broad implications? Is it very specialized? Is it very regionalized? Because every journal, and we can talk about this in the discussion, is I would even say overemphasized on things like impact factor right now. And if you're not familiar with it, impact factor is a measure for each journal that is essentially the number of citations that journal gets divided by the number of papers published in that journal over the past 2 years. So it's typically the one that's reported as a 2-year moving window. And if there's a paper that seems like it's going to be highly cited because it's dealing with very important issues, or maybe it's a very key review article, then there'll be more eagerness to accept that paper. If it's a very kind of small marginal paper, it might be harder to get that into some of the higher impact factor journals. Higher impact factor journals doesn't mean that all those papers are better papers. It doesn't mean that there aren't good papers in all journals, which clearly they are, but just keeping in mind that higher impact factor journals do tend to have a higher rejection rate. And so if you're considering where to send it, if you start with one that has an impact factor of 10 or 12 or something quite high, then there's probably going to be a higher rejection rate there. Another indicator that's used is this idea of H-index. H-index can be thought of at a journal level or even an institute level, but it's usually done as an individual level. And it's a metric that is essentially the number of papers that you have that have been cited at least that number of times. So if you have 10 papers that you've published and each one has been cited 3 times, then your H-index is only 3, because you would have at least 3 that have been cited 3 times. If you have 10 papers published, one was cited 100 times and the others were cited 3, it's still only 3, because it's a measure of both the number of papers and the number of times those have been cited. And I think we can get over driven by these different indices, but just so that you're aware of what they are and that that they're out there. Okay, so let's talk about the paper just a little bit. Every article has a particular structure to it. It has the front material, things like title, authors, abstracts, keywords, and highlights. And then the main body follows typically this IMROD structure, which is introduction, methods, results, discussion. And then the back material, acknowledgements, references, and supplemental material. And each of those has a particular reason why it's there. And so they each need to be taken seriously and given the attention that they need. So I'm going to run through each of those just a little bit. Authors and affiliations, this might seem obvious, but as much as possible, be consistent with how you use your own name. I've seen a lot of people will maybe change their name, in the US, an example, Dave versus David. If you are starting to use, if you're switching back and forth, then the search engines might not recognize that it's the same author. Are you going to use a middle initial or a middle name? Are you going to use, doctor in front of your name? So it does matter, I think, to kind of pick a professional name and be consistent with it, because most of the way that you're going to be found is through these search engines. And so you don't want to have, I found the same thing too. I tend to use a middle initial in my writing, and some of the papers that don't have that are just Brian Fath, don't show up in the same databases that the full name does. Nowadays, you can avoid some of that if you register for an ORCID number, which I would recommend you to do, which is a unique number tagged to you. And so that, I guess, that can alleviate some of the issues with inconsistency of the names, particularly if you have a more common name. That really can be important. Yeah, so the abstract, the idea of the abstract is that it essentially summarizes the same structure: introduction, methods, results, and discussion, and only one or two sentences for each of those. So one sentence about the introduction, what is the paper doing? One section of 1 or 2 sentences of the methods, give the results right there in the abstract, and then 1 or 2 sentences about the implications. The idea of a good abstract is that, honest, precise, can stand alone, uses no technical jargon. Don't use abbreviations and acronyms in your abstract. Don't cite references. Again, it's not the point to be citing references. It's very brief, it's specific. And I think one of the things where people make a mistake is that they look at the abstract as a teaser, as though it's like a movie trailer or something. Like, you're trying to entice somebody to read the rest of the paper by giving them some, in this research, we find these really important results, hoping then that people are going to go and read those results. Tell them what the results are right in the abstract. If they think they're important, then they'll go read the paper. But don't make the abstract a cliffhanger or a teaser of what's going to come. Just lay it all right out there. And yeah, that's I think one of the bigger mistakes that I see in abstracts, is that they are too vague and don't just go right to the best selling point right at the beginning. Keywords are another important thing, because we find articles now through online databases. So your keywords should be specific, but not, again, technical jargon words. Avoid abbreviations, avoid words that are too general. And one of the suggestions that I give people is that basically take your keywords, your 4, 5, 6 keywords that you're going to use for the paper, and just put them in a Google search engine or whatever you want to use, and see what shows up. Because that will tell you immediately, if you're in the right peer group. If the papers that are all showing up that are using your keywords are ones that you've never heard of before, it could be that you just didn't do a very good literature review and you needed to have read those papers. And of course, that's very useful for you, because you can now go and get more information from them. Or you just have bad keywords and you've ended up in the wrong community, essentially. And so then you need to keep trying again. And it's worth that. It's a very short exercise to try to do that once you're ready to submit, but haven't yet, is to make sure that you're in the right group that you want to be in. As I mentioned earlier, abstracts are even becoming too much for people to read these days. So most journals are requiring highlights, which are a short collection of 3 to 5 bullet points. These are limited to even something like 85 characters, perhaps. And it's, again, don't use them as cliffhangers. Tell exactly what the main finding of your result is in those highlights. If they like that, then they'll read the abstract, then maybe they'll read the paper. Okay, the introduction. Let's just go through a little bit briefly on each of these different sections. The introduction is to put your research into context, to set up the problem, to make it clear to the reader why it's an important problem, why you're bringing something new to this situation, what has been done before, how was achieved, but this is brief. It's just to give that context to it. Don't write an extensive review of the field. Most of you, if you are students, I'm sure your advisors have asked you to write a review paper or to do a fairly extensive literature review. That was for your benefit, to become an expert in the field, to get up to speed. But the people that you're writing to are most likely already experts. They don't need to read that. Again, a common mistake is that a lot of students, when they're trying to publish their thesis or dissertation, will try to include all of the review material that was important to them. It was a learning process for them, but it really doesn't need to be part of an introduction to a research paper. Don't cite only your own work. That shows that it's not as, sorry, I'm gonna close this window. I was hoping I could get away with that, but there's noise out there. It's probably warmer where you are, but it is a little bit warm here today, so I had a window open. Then after citing it, don't Describe methods, results, or conclusions. Keep those for the sections that they belong in. Don't overuse terms like novel and for the first time. And you can sell your work without overselling it. Method section, the idea here is to be sufficient so that somebody else could reproduce the research that you're doing. Typically it's good advice to use past tense because this is something that has already happened. You're describing the methods that you used. Okay, so in the results then, use visuals. It's really important. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Figures and tables are, again, the eye-catching things that the readers are going to jump to. Show any of the results of the analyses, statistical analyses that were done, making sure that you're comparing like with like and not speculating beyond what your actual results are showing. Don't duplicate among tables and figures and text, though. You don't need to say the same thing 3 different ways. You can put it in a nice figure and then refer to that in the text. You don't need to have a figure and a text and a table of the same data that maybe you had generated and so on. Yes, graphics, very important. Readers often look at graphics first and many times go no further. Therefore, the reviewer should be particularly sensitive to inclusion of clear and informative graphics. It's really worth the time to think of the best way to visually show what you want to show. And it might not be a simple bar chart or a pie chart or something that you can make easily on Excel. It might be something, more unique or eye-catching than that. So give some thought to the best way to show your results. Now, what's the point of the discussion? The discussion is where, after you've shown everything that you found new in your particular research, you're coming back around to the broader field and talking about implications. So how does this study answer the question that you introduced in the beginning? How does it relate to other studies? The discussion section needs to have references to the literature again. So the methods probably have some references to the literature unless you're generating your entire own method. Results section probably doesn't have much references, but then the discussion clearly will, because the idea is that there were other papers that touched upon the same topic and you are now comparing your research to those. Give all possible interpretations of your finding. If there's, their data can always be interpreted multiple ways and you really want to sell a particular story, that's okay. But if there's still some possibility that it could mean something else, be sure to be open and honest about that and say, well, there's still a possibility that it could be interpreted this other way. And then that leads you to, well, why is that? Well, there were probably some limitations to their study. That just gives you some idea of future work that could be done, some other controls or approaches that could be taken. So those are all things that would go into the discussion section. Yeah, avoid making grand statements that are not supported by the data. Don't introduce new results or terms or a new question in the discussion. That's not the point. If you really wanted to ask that question, ask it earlier such that it flows into the discussion, but don't bring in new arguments and new data at that point. Conclusion can be very short. I think even just 1 paragraph, 2 paragraphs. It's your last chance to hammer home what you did, why it was important, and how it advances the field. You could suggest future experiments here. I think it's also okay if you put that in the discussion, but it's, again, just the summary of the results that you found in that paper. Don't restate things word for word. That's really one of the annoying things, that people take just the first several sentences of their introduction and then put them in the conclusion again. So repetition is not needed. Only talk about what your study talked about. Don't be overly speculative. Sometimes we want to think that our research solved problems that it didn't really address. That's not the place for this. And again, this idea of selling your work, but don't oversell it. I think that that's also a fair line to follow. All right, so acknowledgements are important. You probably didn't do this work alone. This is your chance to thank anybody, acknowledge anybody that's helped you along the way. You can be precise here. You can take a sentence and say they specifically helped you find some data, or with the literature review or proofreading your paper or something like that. And the acknowledgements are also, of course, where you would put any funding sources, grant reference numbers, and so on. that are important for documentation there. Now, about the references. Every journal has their own style on how they do references. And it's, again, important to check that. This is one area, though, where it's probably gotten more lenient over the years, because the way that most journals are dealing with it, they can manipulate that once you submit it. So my own journals have also went from being, very precise on you following all of our guidelines versus we don't really care. But check with the journal. And of course, it's better to use the same style that the journal uses. Check spelling of all the authors, punctuation, and so on with the reference style. Whenever possible, unpublished observations, personal communications, ones that are in review or unpublished are weaker references. And they might not be allowable by some journals, because the whole idea of peer review is that you are building on the footsteps of things that have already been out in the literature and peer reviewed. Sometimes you can't find articles in the common language, which is typically English for publishing. But if possible, try to avoid non-English journals. And again, this idea of self-citation. If you only have 20 references and 10 of them are from your own papers, it doesn't show a very broad understanding of the field, and that's clearly frowned upon. I mean, not only from the point of view that you aren't, acknowledging the rest of the field, but there's the implications that you're self-citing in order to increase your own scores, and really only cite the papers of your own that are relevant for that particular study. Most likely, everything you've published before is not going to be relevant for the next paper that you're going to publish. Supplementary material is really getting common nowadays because everything is electronic. And so in the old days, before you could maybe put something in an appendix that would show up still in print, and that's still possible, I would guess, with some journals. But with supplementary material, you can add, I've seen people have 100 pages of supplemental material that's only available online. You can include the data, the code that you're using, for example, whatever supporting material that you have. Nowadays also, though, I would look into maybe some of that as publishable. There are more and more journals that are taking code or taking data, but if not, and it's needed for that paper, then you can always go ahead and tuck it into supplementary material. Okay, so you want your article to look and read as good as possible. I know everyone is not the best writer, or it's a second or third language, but it's where in the end getting accepted or not might come down to. So as this quote says, that journal editors overloaded with quality manuscripts may make decisions on manuscripts based on formal criteria like grammar or spelling. Don't get rejected for avoidable mistakes, and make sure your manuscript looks perfect. So you've spent months probably on the research, maybe a year or more. And when you're right at that final moment of wanting to submit it, you just want to get it off the desk. I know I've been there, but it's the time to slow down, read it again carefully, and make sure that it doesn't have really glaring mistakes, because editors will see that and maybe just dismiss a good report because there's a couple typos in the abstract, and they look at it and say, oh, the authors were, careless, and reject it for that. Okay, so, what are things to keep in mind? Clarity, conciseness, and correctness. So good writing, so that it's clear what you're doing, strong subject noun sentences, read each one read each sentence, as a language professor, what is it really saying? What is the action here? What is going on? And be concise with that. And of course, obviously you have to be accurate. Some common traps that people have when they're writing, repetition, I mentioned, redundancy, ambiguity, exaggeration. These are not just annoyances for editors, but these are annoyances for readers as well too. So try to pay attention as you're proofreading there. So some of the other common traps, just to give a few examples, and this is not a writing, I'm not digging into sentence structure here too much. It's more of a broad level overview, but a couple examples: inconsistent tense. Right? When you're writing, in one sentence, you don't want past tense and present tense. So read for these things. Train yourself, or hire somebody, or ask somebody that is good at this. But it's important. Inconsistent use of plural and singular, very easily avoidable things. It's a plural noun, and that they used a singular verb there. So read for those. One of my pet peeves is incorrect use of et al. So in our work, there's oftentimes multiple authors, right? If it's one author, that's fine. If it's two authors, you usually give both of them credit. If there's three or more authors, it's common to just use the first author's name and then say et al, because it can get cumbersome to type out everybody's name there. And keeping in mind that et al is actually short for the Latin et alia, meaning and others. It's a direct translation from the Latin. And so et is a complete word. You don't have to do anything to it. Just leave it alone. But ali is an abbreviation for, al is an abbreviation for alia. So that needs the period there. So the correct way is et space al period whenever you're using et al, either in the reference or in the citations throughout the text. So what do you do before you actually hit that send button? As I said, that tends to be our rushed moment. Even though we've patiently been working on something for months, that how can you avoid early rejection? And the first thing I recommend is again, just put the pause button on for a few days. Ask somebody to look at it. Ask them to be critical. You don't want to just give it to your office mate and then they glance at it and say, yeah, it looks good to me. Go ahead and send it. I mean, really ask somebody to read it, every word of it, and to be critical and say, hey, I don't understand this sentence. I don't understand this section. These results don't really reinforce what you were talking about in the discussion, or whatever the case may be. That the first paper I published, that another colleague in my graduate program, I asked him to read it, and his response to me was, I would reject this paper. And I thought that was quite critical, but then he had some good points to make, and I was able to revise it based on his comments before it actually was submitted. Check again the guide to authors. One last pass through there that you've met all the requirements of the journal is a good thing. Again, one more time, after you've compiled it all and put it together, well, is this really the right journal? Because when I was writing at the end, I thought I was targeting this journal, but my discussion actually went more in this other direction. Maybe I should think about another journal. Again, check that your literature cited is balanced and everything is clear and significant. Now, the cover letter. Sometimes you'll hear that this is one of the most important pieces. I actually disagree as an editor. It is your point to speak to the editor directly without having to, it's not a formal part of the paper, but when so many of these are coming in, if you write a 2 or 3 page cover letter, I'm going to skim that very, very quickly, if at all. I'll just look to see that the main things are there. And so it's a wasted effort, honestly, I think. And maybe I'm unique in that sense of an editor, but I don't think so. I think that really the point of the cover letter is to convey the main results that you have and say that you don't have any conflict of interest, right? You've not submitted it anywhere else. And then, of course, suggesting potential reviewers, which I'll talk about that more in just a second as well, too. So this is what your letter should include. Again, something about who you're addressing it to. I think it's important to address it to somebody. I mean, look up who is the editor of the journal. I think it's also amusing when I will get cover letters that have the wrong journal on it. And so obviously what happened was the author submitted it to the other journal. They got it rejected. Within an hour, they wanted to submit it to another journal. They didn't even update the cover letter. And so then, they sent it off to my journal. And I see that. I see that it was actually intended originally for another journal. And yeah, it's carelessness. And if I'm really in a playful mood, I'll write back and say to the authors, "Oh, I'm sorry, this is more appropriate for the other journal." And I knowing that they had just hit a dead end at that one. But yeah, don't make that mistake. All you really need to put in there is a couple sentences about who you are and who the authors are, what the main findings are. half a page tops, right? A couple sentences, confirm the originality, that it's not being submitted elsewhere, and that there are no competing financial interests. So once you've done that, once you've hit send and everything is there together, and also plan, it's great that we have electronic submission systems, but it probably is going to take you a couple hours to work your way through all those different pieces and upload everything and review the PDF and all of that. So if you're rushed or if you're tired, again, maybe wait until the next day when you have a block of time, when you're fresh, to make sure that you're putting your paper together correctly in the submission. You don't want to have it rejected again for something silly at the very end. Now, here's what happens, right? So you submit your paper, and if it's not rejected as out of scope or as having some major flaws, it's going to be sent for review. Finding reviewers is the most difficult thing for any editor to do, because there's just so many papers and so many need, for reviews, and everybody is busy, and reviewing papers takes time. And this review period, I think 3 months is a minimum time to be patient. If an author contacts me after 6 weeks or 4 weeks and says, hey, what's the status of my paper? It's kind of like, we're working on it. That's what just the process that unfolds here. So, and it's not uncommon. I've had that take 12 months for papers I've submitted. And sometimes it's just the reality of that situation. In fact, I had one just recently. It was almost a record. I think it was about 18 months that I submitted a paper to a journal. I won't mention the journal by name. And after about a year, I did contact them, and they said, well, we're still working on it. And about a year and a half, contact them again. And then they finally got me the reviews back, and it needed revision. And I revised the paper and I resubmitted it. And that's already been about 4 to 6 months ago. Second revision should not take so long. But anyways, I'm being patient because it's an experiment from my end to see how long they're going to take. But yeah, so first decision comes back to you after a matter of some months. If it's not reject, if it's some sort of revision, then you have a chance to spend some time revising it, which I'll talk a lot more about in just some detail, but keeping the milestones in mind. You resubmit it. Most likely it's going to go for re-review, so it's going to take a few more months. Then it comes back, and then here it's probably going to be either accepted or rejected, so there won't be too much more work, but maybe a little bit more minor revisions. Point is, this takes time. We've had the unfortunate situation where somebody submits an article to the journal and says, hey, I'm defending my PhD. Here we are in July, and they say I'm defending in September. I need to have my paper, I need to have a decision by my paper by September. And I tell them, well, the only decision I'll have by September is reject, because there's really no way that we can go through this whole thing that condensed. I mean, we do make efforts, of course, sometimes and try to expedite reviews, but the reality is this is a multi-month, almost 1 year process. And some journals are pushing to do all of this faster, but the ramping up of everything is not the solution either. So here are just some statistics for ecological modeling. One of the last years that I was there, we got about 900 submissions a year, which is of course a lot of papers. The first decision was, on average, was done within 9 weeks. That was because we had about 40% of our papers that were rejected as out of scope. And then I would make that decision within 48 hours usually, because I would try to stay on top of things. And of course that helps bring our average down. Papers that actually went for review then would take closer to probably 3 months. Author's revision time, 8.8 weeks, so a little over 2 months. Now, it might take that much time. It might be that you're asked to do more model runs or additional research and data analysis. But it's also not a time when you want to be too casual about it, right? The clock is on your hand now. You can't control the clock when it's in the reviewer's hands, but you can control the clock when it's on your side. And then, so final decisions then would be about 15 weeks for us. The journal was rejecting 63% of the papers, and we had an impact factor on 2.5 or so. It's actually just closer to 3 now. But yeah, again, that's typical that the majority of papers get rejected. So here's what happens when you finally get those review comments back. I think it's the most important stage at this point. I mean, you had to do everything right up to now. but doing a good job on the reviewer comments can really help everybody and cut down some time. So respond to all the points. Even if you disagree with the point, don't just ignore it, but say the reviewer said this and I respectfully disagree. Here's why, here's some additional references that support my side. Here's the points I'm trying to make. You should have had line numbers in your paper so that you can provide page and line numbers referring to revision. Say, okay, I've added a new sentence on lines 82 to 91 that describes such and such to respond to the reviewers and so on. If you need to do more research and experiments, do those. It's only going to make your paper stronger. Don't try to argue your way out of, well, I did everything to tell my story. If the reviewers really suggest, well, this will be a lot stronger if you look at some other scenarios or do another experiment, then yeah, do it. You want the strongest possible paper. I mean, that's actually the whole benefit of the system that we have, right? I mean, you're getting somebody, a stranger, to volunteer their time to make your paper better. And in the end, your paper is going to be better because of that. So don't take the review criticisms negatively, right? So that's, again, something I'll say about more in just a second. Clearly differentiate your response from the reviewers. So a lot of times authors will use a different color in the text. So they will very clearly say the review said this and my reply is this. I've seen other people use a table format. The reviewer says this, here's my response. And do that point by point by point for everything that is in the review. That is the best, cleanest way to make that clear. Now, whether it's rejection or even just critical comments, don't take it personally. The review process is there to improve the work. Try to understand what the reviewer is saying. Try to understand why it has been rejected. Evaluate honestly. Will your paper meet the journal's requirements with the addition of more data, or maybe it's just you better off going to another journal. But as I said, don't just take that same paper and resubmit it immediately the same day to another journal. Even if they have rejected it, they've probably provided some review comments. They've probably given you some suggestions. And if you're going to another journal, you still need to revise your paper, right? Spend more time on it. Again, we have this interesting psychology where we try to rush things at the wrong moments, but whatever the new journal is, check their guide for authors. They might have different formatting, different referencing, and so on. Okay, so conclusions for this first part of this seminars is it's really key to find the right journal so that you know your audience, follow the guide to the authors for that particular journal, be clear, concise, and correct in the paper, seek feedback from colleagues along the way, and take each paper as a learning opportunity for you, not just the research itself. I mean, the research is, I think, why we're in this area is we like doing research and discovering new things, but the paper itself is a learning experience. Doing the background, thinking about the context that it fits into. And it's also a teaching opportunity. You're teaching either your colleagues, you're teaching your peers, you're teaching yourself something in this process. And lastly, yeah, have fun. This is your chosen profession. And if you're going to be doing research or being in academia, publishing is the currency that we use to evaluate success. And if you don't like publishing, yeah, you might not be in the right place. So you should enjoy that. And then finally, you will get some letter from the editor that says, I'm pleased to inform you your paper has been accepted. Thank you for submitting your work. And you can, have a little celebration at that point. So, okay. I'll be glad to pause here and take some questions and see where we are. Let me stop sharing so that I can see what's going on there.
Yes, there are a few questions for you.
Yes.
Brian, it's in the chat box. So I'll read out the question for you. The first question is from Bhagavati. The question is a very nice presentation and informative. I have two inquiries. The first question is, which one have more weightage, the first author or the corresponding author? And a second question is, what is the allowed percentage of plagiarism for manuscript writing?
Okay, Let me take the second question first. So nowadays, most journals, including ours in current research, environmental sustainability, does a similarity check. And so we see when the paper comes in, whether it has 9% similarity or 47% similarity with something that's out in the, already in the cloud somewhere, right? So our general rule of thumb is anything over 25% is seriously problematic. I mean, I think that even if it were between 10 and 25%, I would start to, point that out to the authors, but 25% is kind of you will get rejected for having that much. Now, the thing is that we can see where it's coming from. It might be that you have 67% similarity, but you've actually published it as a preprint somewhere in archive, or maybe you've published it as a dissertation at your university. And if I see that it finds that, those are not copyrighted venues. And so then you actually have the right to republish it. So it's not just a matter of looking at a number. I need to know where that's coming from. If I see that your number is 47% and you've basically crawled the internet and taken big chunks of material from the internet or from your other published papers or from other people's published papers, then clearly that's plagiarism. And so I would ask the authors to revise that. A normal paper, if you're writing a fresh paper with new results, it's going to have less than 10%. I mean, you should be rephrasing the methods, you should be rephrasing introduction and so on. So do avoid, again, I know it's tempting for people that are writing in a second language to, they find something from another paper that describes the methodology very well, and you just want to cut and paste that into your manuscript. Don't do that. I mean, it just will, it's giving you, it's going to raise more problems than that. About the ordering of authors, that really depends on the discipline, right? It's interesting. In some disciplines, the last author is typically the corresponding author and kind of the director of the lab, let's say, and that's seen as the kind of key figure. Sometimes it's the first author that is always the highest, and so it's somewhat discipline specific. My reading on that is that the first author is the one who really led and drove that research, and the first author did most of the research and did most of the writing of the paper. And so I think the first author is the one who I recognize as the main contributor. Again, in our field, like ecological modeling and sustainability, I think it typically goes in order. We don't do the last author thing. So the second author would be the second most important, third author, third most important down the line. If you want to list your advisor as the corresponding author instead of yourself, I think that's fine, but I think it's also good practice for you to be the corresponding author, and then you get the experience of dealing with the journal process and so on. So I guess the bottom line is I think the first author is the one who's more important than the corresponding author.
Thank you very much, Professor Bryant, for answering that question. I hope, Bhagavathi, you got your answers. So the next question is from Sai Fulahai Adam. The question is, what's the criteria for selecting a journal?
Right. So the most important thing is who the audience of that journal is. So you have to think about what your research is. What are you trying to say? Are you finding some new methods? You go to a methods journal. Is it something more interdisciplinary? Is it something that is a regional case study? If it's a regional case study, don't go to an international journal. That's one of the things I'm finding with current research is that there's a lot of local studies that don't really have implications at a broader scale. And there are regional journals out there that the international audience is not going to gain much from this. So choosing a journal is what's the story you want to tell and who's the audience that is appropriate for that. And there are some ways of matching to find journals that the different publishers will have. They'll recommend, okay, what are your keywords? What is the type of research? And then they'll recommend journals. But yeah, it's important, but it's just matching what the story you want to tell with the audience that is with that journal.
And let me read out the next question for you. That is from Aravinda. The question is, if we get the help from someone outside of the work, to proofread and correct grammar? Should we include him as an author?
Yeah, good question. No, I mean, again, these are research papers. So the authors are people that contributed intellectually to the paper. There are writing services that are not looking at the science at all. Now, if when the person is reading it, they notice something that was wrong with your results, or they had a new fresh interpretation, and they said, hey, why don't you also do this? You know, maybe they can rise to having a contribution. But somebody that is correcting grammar, you can acknowledge them at the end, but that wouldn't be in authorship.
The next question is from Feradi Abiyu. The question is, thank you for your nice presentation. I enjoyed and I like it. I have one question. What are the total words is possible for keywords for a single manuscript?
Yeah, it's going to vary a little bit for the journal, but typically it's somewhere between 4 and 8 keywords. And we all try to play with that a little bit by having, like, I'll use network analysis. Is that one keyword or does it count as 2? I think it's, you know, short phrases like that, sustainable development goals, right? That's one keyword. But yeah, it's usually on the order of 6 plus or minus, depending on the journal.
Okay, and we have one more question. It's from Zeba Alam. The question is, thank you for an excellent presentation. My question is regarding the publication fees. Many journals with high impact factor also charge very high publication fee, which is an issue, especially for the universities from developing world to pay. May I know how do we solve this issue, as this is perhaps creating another division in the research field of have and have nots?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the and it's not clear how this is all going to all resolve itself. So as you know, many journals are going to open access as a benefit to the authors, because then anybody can find your papers. They don't have to have the subscriptions to it. But then now the burden is on the author to have to actually pay. And I always thought it was funny. I've have students that think I get paid when I write my papers, and it said, you know, it's the opposite. Best case scenario is I take a year's worth of my work and my intellectual property, and I hand it to a publisher for free, and they publish it under, you know, with my name. Now they're asking me to hand them my journal and my article and $1,000, and it is kind of crazy. And it's not an issue just with the developing countries. A lot of people, and you know, in my university don't have budgets to pay $1,200 for every paper we want to publish. Yeah, I honestly don't have a good answer to that. And I think it's where the whole journal publishing world is most fluid and most unresolved on how this is going to be in the next 5, 10, 20 years. The one thing I will say is that I know that in our journal, Current Research Environmental Sustainability, we have tiered pricing that there, you know, if you're coming from developing countries, either the fee is waived completely or it is it's discounted. So I think many journals are aware of the purchasing power of the submitting authors and trying to accommodate for that. It raises the whole other issue of predatory journals, that there are some journals that really have a very loose peer review because they just want to collect your $1,000 or whatever the cost is, and then you know, they basically accept anything, and they are you know, deforming the market, because you know, as an author's point of view, you might be going up for promotion or tenure or you know, needing more papers on your CV, so you get 2 or 3 of these papers that are fairly weak papers, but you publish them anyways. Again, in the long run, that's just going to hurt your resume. There's more attention being paid to these predatory journals, so do avoid that. But it's definitely not the case that every journal that charges you is a predatory journal. I think it more or less used to be that the only journals that would make you pay would be the ones that would be a little suspicious, but that's not really the case now, because there's some pretty reputable journals that are organized in a way where they want to go away from subscription costs, and therefore they are charging the authors. One other way that you can maybe build this in is that when you're writing for grants, be sure to write in publication costs and say, hey, I expect to write 5 papers out of this 5-year project. Therefore, I'm going to ask for another, you know, 15,000 euros in order to cover those costs. Maybe that's idealistic, but that's becoming pretty common. And then also within your institutions, make it, be vocal. And I know monies are tight, but it might be just as important as getting stuff for your lab, resources that you do to run your experiments, and say, well, now, hey, I need to have $2,000 a year to publish papers, and negotiate for that as part of that. But I wouldn't be surprised, having said that somehow this whole thing also is not settled. That how this idea of making authors pay to get their own work published does seem a little squirrely to me, and that there may be still a new way. So I'm anxious for some creative solutions to this problem. One of the ways that is, I think, somewhat creative is this idea of reviewing that I mentioned earlier. So as the editor, it's not uncommon for me to invite 10, 15, even 20 different reviewers before I get to actually agree and review the paper. I mean, everybody is just so stressed for time, and to take, to review a paper takes, a day, half a day to a day probably. You have to read through it carefully. You have to write up the summary comments, and you should take it seriously. It doesn't help the author or the editor if you send back a 2-sentence review, and so do take it seriously. But there are some journals out there that what they're doing is they're allowing you to basically publish in their journals at a discount if you review for them. So every paper you review, you bank a certain amount of money. And if you review enough papers, you essentially can publish for free. Again, I think that's more of a short-term solution than the real clean solution here, because there's still kind of unintended monies being transferred. We've thought of the idea of paying reviewers to do reviews directly, like cash payments, but that's of course more complicated. But this idea of getting a voucher for when you want to publish is important. Now, let me say one other thing about reviewing before we move on, is that you actually have some obligation to review if you publish, right? So when you submit your paper, you're getting 2 reviews on that paper. So there's a pay it forward concept that if that journal is asking you to review 2 papers, it's only fair, really, that you return the favor, because you've taken their reviewers and used them to your benefit. And I have some authors that have published 4, 5, 6 times in my journal, and always decline every single review that I request that I send them. And I mean, I get it, but there's a little bit of a bad karma about that, I believe. You pay it forward. So if you've had a paper published somewhere, you more or less owe that journal a couple of reviews. But reviewing is also a great experience, especially if you're a young researcher. You get to read more papers. It gives you more insight on how good papers look and how bad papers look. It gets you up to date on the current cutting edge of the field, because you're reading papers that aren't even yet published. Assumingly, you're reading papers that are very close to your subject matter. And so you don't want to sink all your time in that. You have other things to do. But I think if you review one paper a month or one paper every other month, that's a very reasonable way to train yourself and to stay up in the field. So I definitely encourage that. Okay.
There is, I think, one more question from Sharmila Jagadishan. The question is, I wanted to publish my paper in Scopus. I looked for a journal based on the scope of the journal and Schemmogo website. Actually, I clarified with the editor, and he confirmed whether the journal is Scopus or not. He claimed that the journal is Scopus and the paper has been published. The publisher gave us a certificate with Scopus seal, but unfortunately, we came to know that it is not Scopus. When I'm requesting the editor to remove my paper, and he is not doing it, please advise.
Yeah, very specific question. Possibly what happened was, I don't have all the details, but I'm involved in some new journals, like Current Research was a new journal, and there's a lag time for a new journal appearing and getting papers in it before it can be indexed and getting impact factors. And so again, I know you have immediate needs, but it might be that it will become indexed and in Scopus. The journals have to apply for those statuses. And so, so there may be some good news for you, I guess, in the end, and that the paper will, the journal will still have some indexing, and then it would catch that in the net. In the short term, though, I think that it's not easy to withdraw a paper that's already published. I think there has to be some sort of evidence of serious like error or conflict or something that was brought up, because I'm pretty sure that when you submitted the paper and signed off on all the consent forms, that somewhere that was you agreeing in that fine print that they now have copyright of your material. So I can understand that it's probably difficult for the publisher to now pull that paper and then you go somewhere else for it. And that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but it might be that you can't do anything at this point, other than, as I said, it's possible that the paper will still be indexed going forward.
I think there is one last question from Sharmila: how to identify predatory journals?
Yeah, good question. Well, first of all, they will all charge author fees because that's their business model. And like I said, it doesn't mean that all journals that charge fees are predatory, but it's kind of the first filter. From there, there's actually some pretty good websites that will, if you just search for predatory journals, they publish lists of them. There are certain publishers that have reputations. Again, I won't name names right now, I'll let you do that research, but that have the reputation that they're not really serious journals. And so that's really the best place. And some evaluators then, like I said, are basically not giving credit for that. So if those are on your CV and you're applying for a job, in fact, if anything, it probably would show up as a negative mark on your research. So yeah, I would just do the background. You can find online lists of these journals, and there's gray area. I mean, one person's list might have some journals that aren't on another person's list because, some journals might, actually publish an occasional real paper, but also not, have the filter to keep out bad papers. And so I don't think there's any, well, maybe there are a few journals that are just truly evil, but that's unlikely. It's unfortunately not as simple as that. But I have seen these lists. If you look for them, list of predatory journals, that's a first good guidance of which ones to avoid. So thank you for all these very good questions.
I think that's all the questions we have for now, Professor Brian.
Okay. All right. Hopefully that was useful, and I appreciate it. Good luck with your writing careers.
Is there anything else that you would like to share, Professor Brian, or would you like to conclude this session?
I actually see there's a hand that just went up in the, somebody wants to ask a question.
Yes, I think Moazu, you are on screen, so you can unmute yourself and directly ask the question if you would like to ask the question.
Thank you, Dr. Brian. That is a very wonderful presentation. We really appreciate. At least we have changed some of our mindsets regarding publication now. My request is that I will indulge you to share your slides with us, maybe via our emails. That we keep on, whenever we want to publish, we keep on get ourselves reminded with all your presentation. Thank you very much. That's my request.
Okay, yeah, no problem. I will send the slides that I just showed over so you can share them. So, okay, yeah, good. No, I don't have anything to add other than my final words were have fun with this, right? This is what you've chosen to do and spend your time with. So find the things you enjoy about it. Good luck, everybody.
Thank you so very much, Professor Brian. It was an excellent presentation. It was very informative for all the researchers all around the world. So a big thank you on behalf of the AMS Association and behalf of our research institute for doing this excellent presentation, giving informative session for all our researchers around the world. So thank you very much, Professor Brian, for your valuable time and effort for this workshop.
You're welcome. Thanks, Austin. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much. And also, I would like to thank all the participants all around the world taking your time to attend this workshop. I'm pretty sure it was very useful for you. And on behalf of the AEMS Association, we would like to also invite for our conferences that's coming up next year in February and March, which is the Climate Change Conference, which is scheduled to be held in February, and also our Waste Management Conference, which is in March. So we will send you this information by email with the slides that was presented today by. So with the slides, we will send the information regarding the conference. And as we texted, since you attended this webinar, you have a special and partial scholarship to attend our conference, and also opportunity to publish your research papers in the journals we have affiliated with. So we'll send more information. Stay tuned, and more events and webinars will be coming up in the next coming months. So stay tuned and be in touch with the AEMS Association and with our conferences. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Brian.